People around Inman Lake do not describe the water the same way outsiders do. Visitors see a quiet lake in rural Kansas. Locals talk about depth, not ordinary depth measured by rope or sonar, hidden depth, the kind that feels wrong beneath a flat stretch of water. That was where I first heard the name Sinkhole Sam. At first it sounded less like a creature and more like a joke passed between fishermen, the sort of exaggerated lake story common throughout the Midwest, but the people telling it were not smiling. Most described the same thing, a long, dark shape beneath still water, sometimes surfacing briefly near the reeds, sometimes moving between sinkholes connected below the lake bed, and occasionally appearing in places where no large animal should reasonably exist. The strange part was not the sightings themselves. It was where they occurred. Inman Lake is not deep enough or large enough to support the kind of creature witnesses described, yet stories persisted across decades. Farmers claimed livestock avoided certain shorelines entirely. Children were warned not to swim near the southern coves after heavy rain. And old fishermen spoke about underwater openings beneath the lake that supposedly connected to flooded caverns below the plains. One elderly man at the dock told me quietly, "The lake's bigger underneath than above." That sentence stayed with me. I arrived during late summer when drought had lowered water levels across much of the region. Mud banks extended farther than usual around portions of the shoreline, exposing reeds and rock formations normally hidden below the surface. It also revealed something else: holes, not random depressions, large circular sink formations descending sharply into dark water near the western edge of the lake. Locals avoided boating directly over them. Nobody could explain exactly how deep they were. Some claimed weighted lines disappeared without reaching bottom. Others believed underground currents connected to the lake to flooded tunnel systems stretching for miles beneath Kansas farmland. That evening I met a fisherman named Carl Dugan repairing nets beside an aging dock. Carl had lived near the lake most of his life and spoke about Sinkhole Sam without dramatics. To him, the creature was simply part of the area, dangerous if disturbed, otherwise mostly unseen. According to Carl, sightings increased during drought years when the water dropped low enough to expose the outer sinkholes. "That's when he moves more," Carl said. I asked what exactly people believed Sam was. Carl shrugged. "Depends who you ask. Some called it a giant eel. Others described something more reptilian. A few claimed it resembled an enormous salamander moving just below the surface. But nearly every account agreed on one thing: length. Witnesses consistently described something far larger than the lake should contain. Before sunset, Carl pointed toward the western shore where the exposed sinkholes cut into the waterline. "You see bubbles out there after dark," he said quietly. "Don't row toward them." I asked whether he had. Carl stared toward the lake for several seconds before answering. "Once." Then somewhere far across the still evening water, a cluster of bubbles rose briefly near the largest sinkhole and disappeared. The following morning, Carl Dugan agreed to take me onto the lake, not across it, around it. That distinction became important quickly. He avoided the western side entirely while steering the small aluminium boat through calmer, open water near the northern reeds. The lake looked ordinary at first glance beneath early sunlight: flat water, migrating birds, wind pushing slowly across the grasslands surrounding the shore. But the farther west we drifted, the quieter the lake became. Carl noticed it too. "Listen," he said. At first I heard nothing unusual. Then I realized what he meant: no birds near the sinkholes. The eastern side of the lake carried constant natural noise: ducks, insects, movement in the reeds. Out here near the western depressions, silence settled over the water strangely. Even the wind seemed softer. The sinkholes themselves appeared gradually beneath the surface as dark circular sections of water, some only a few yards wide, others large enough to swallow entire boats. The biggest one sat nearly 50 yards offshore, where the lake bed dropped sharply into black water impossible to see through. Carl kept the boat well away from it. According to him, several fishermen over the years claimed their lines became tangled far below the lake bed near those openings, not snagged on rock, pulled. One man reportedly lost nearly an entire spool of line before cutting it loose. I asked whether anyone ever tried diving into the sinkholes. Carl laughed once without humor. A couple of boys tried back in the 60s. What happened? One came back up. That answer ended the subject briefly. As we drifted farther along the western edge, Carl pointed toward a weathered section of shoreline where old fence posts leaned into shallow water. A local farmer once kept cattle there decades earlier. According to Carl, livestock occasionally disappeared during drought seasons when the shoreline receded close to the sinkholes. No tracks leading away, no remains, just missing animals. The farmer eventually abandoned the pasture completely. Then Carl showed me something else. Near the muddy bank, several long grooves cut through the exposed shoreline. At first, they resembled erosion marks left by falling water levels, but the lines curved unnaturally toward the nearest sinkhole, parallel, smooth, as though something heavy had dragged itself repeatedly between the lake and deeper water. Carl refused to let the boat drift closer. Too shallow there, he muttered. That statement confused me immediately. Won't shallow water be safer? Carl shook his head. That's where people see him. We remained near the outer edge of the western basin another 20 minutes before turning back towards safer water. That was when the boat engine suddenly died, not sputtered, stopped completely. Carl tried restarting it twice without success. The lake around us had gone completely still. No wind, no movement in the reeds. Then something bumped the underside of the boat, softly, once. Carl froze immediately. A second impact followed moments later beneath the stern. Longer this time. Not a strike. Pressure. Like something large passing slowly underneath us. I leaned carefully over the side, searching the dark water below. At first I saw only reflection. Then a shape moved beneath the surface. Long, dark, far larger than the boat itself. It did not rise, did not thrash. It simply continued gliding beneath us toward the nearest sinkhole, and just before disappearing into deeper black water, part of its body turned enough to reveal pale skin beneath the surface, smooth, almost amphibian. After the incident over the western sinkholes, Carl Dugan refused to take the boat out again for several days, not because he doubted what passed beneath us, because he recognized it. That distinction mattered. You don't stay around it once it notices the boat, he told me. The lake itself seemed different afterward, smaller somehow, not physically smaller, just more deceptive. Once you understand that something could move beneath those waters unseen, every quiet section of the shoreline began feeling connected to something underneath. That afternoon, Carl brought me to the southern side of Inman Lake, where tall reeds surrounded a shallow cove partially cut off from the main water. Locals avoided swimming there, especially after heavy rain. According to Carl, the part of the lake contained smaller submerged sink openings hidden beneath mud and vegetation. The place looked harmless enough in daylight. Children once used the shoreline for fishing. Families held picnics there years earlier before the story spread wider through the community. Then the Carl told me about the boy. The incident happened nearly 15 years earlier during late summer drought conditions, much like the current season. A teenager named Matthew Harlow reportedly disappeared while swimming near the cove with friends. At first, they assumed he drowned, but the witnesses described something strange moments before he vanished. The water around them suddenly began bubbling near one of the reed beds, despite no movement elsewhere on the lake. Then Matthew shouted once and disappeared beneath the surface. No splashing afterward, no resurfacing, just still water. Search crews dragged the cove for 2 days. Nothing was recovered, no body, no clothing, not even signs of struggle in the mud. Officially, the case remained classified as an accidental drowning. Unofficially, locals blamed Sinkhole Sam. I asked Carl whether anyone actually saw a creature during the disappearance. He nodded slowly. One kid said he saw a tail. What kind of tail? Carl stared toward the reeds, long enough to bend through the grass. We walked farther along the shoreline where drought had exposed cracked mud flats near the waterline. That was where I noticed something unusual. Openings. Small circular holes scattered through the exposed lake bed. Some no wider than a dinner plate, others large enough to fit a man's arm. Water moved slowly through several of them despite the lake remaining mostly still. Underground current. Carl refused to step near the larger openings. Those connect somewhere, he said quietly. Before sunset, we reached an abandoned wooden pier extending partially into the cove. Most of it had collapsed years earlier. The remaining section leaned crooked above shallow dark water thick with reeds underneath. Carl stopped walking suddenly. There were fresh marks on the old wood, mud, long streaks crossing several planks from the water's edge toward the center of the pier. Not footprints, drag marks, wet, recent. And beside one section of warped wood, a strange coating of slime reflected faintly in the evening light. Carl crouched beside it silently. Then he stood immediately. "We leave now." I asked what frightened him. He pointed toward the water beneath the pier. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then bubbles began rising slowly through the reeds below us. One cluster, then another, then a third farther out in the cove. The water surface trembled lightly around them despite no wind touching the lake. Carl backed away from the pier without taking his eyes off the water. Then, somewhere beneath the reeds, something moved. The reeds under the pier shifted again, not from wind, from pressure moving beneath the water. Carl Dugan grabbed my arm and pulled me several steps back from the old boards immediately. The bubbling continued spreading outward through the cave in slow clusters, almost like something traveling beneath the mud rather than swimming openly through water. That detail unsettled me more than a direct sighting above would have. Whatever moved below us seemed to understand the hidden channels beneath the lake bed itself. The old pier groaned softly, one loose plank near the edge tilted upward slightly as water pushed beneath it from below. Then came a sound, not loud, just a wet scraping noise against the submerged supports underneath the structure. Carl whispered without looking away from the water, "He's under there." The bubbling stopped suddenly after that. The entire cove became still. No insects, no movements in the reeds. Every distant bird calls across the lake seemed strangely muted for several long seconds. Then part of the water beneath the pier darkened. A shape passed slowly upward from below the surface. At first I mistook it for shadow from the collapsing boards, but shadows do not move against current. This did. Long, smooth, curving beneath the reeds in one continuous motion. Only a section became visible clearly through the shallow water. Pale gray skin, not scaled like a fish, not rough like a reptile, smooth and slick, almost like the hide of an enormous amphibian. Then something brushed one of the submerged pier supports. The entire structure trembled slightly. Carl stepped farther backward immediately. I remained staring on the water long enough to notice another detail. The shape was wider than expected, not eel-thin, thick-bodied, powerful enough to displace mud beneath the reeds without fully surfacing. Suddenly the water erupted beside the pier, not violently, just enough for a massive tail-like section of body to break briefly above the surface before slamming back beneath the cove. The movement lasted perhaps 1 second, but it revealed impossible size, far too large for any known animal living naturally in Kansas lakes. Carl swore under his breath. Then the old pier shifted sharply sideways. One support beam snapped underwater with a loud crack. The front half of the structure collapsed partially into the cove, sending rotten boards splashing into dark water below. At the same moment, something huge rolled beneath the surface directly under the wreckage. For an instant, I saw the outline of a head beneath the waterline, broad, flattened, and pale, compared to the darker body behind it. Then it vanished beneath the reeds again. Carl did not wait any longer. He started moving quickly along the shoreline away from the cove while daylight faded between the western fields. I followed close behind. Only once we reached the higher ground near the road did he finally stop. Neither of us spoke immediately. Then Carl looked back toward the southern cove, barely visible through tall grass. "That thing doesn't stay in the lake," he said quietly. I asked what he meant. Carl pointed toward the exposed sinkholes farther west. "It uses them." The realization settled slowly, not separate locations, connected ones. The lake, the cove, the underground openings beneath the mud, all part of the same hidden water system beneath Kansas farmland. And somewhere inside it, something large was moving between them unseen. The idea that the lake connected to something larger beneath the ground changed the way I looked at the entire region afterward, not as isolated water, but as openings, entrances into a hidden system underneath the plains. Carl Dugan seemed to believe that already. The following morning he drove me several miles north of Inman Lake along an aging dirt road locals called Dry Creek Road. The land there looked ordinary enough. Flat fields, windmills, scattered cattle pastures stretching toward the horizon. Nothing about the landscape suggested underground waterways or unexplained creatures, until Carl pointed out the depressions, sinkholes, some shallow, others deep enough to fence off completely. According to Carl, new holes occasionally appeared after periods of heavy rain or drought when underground water pressure shifted beneath the farmland. One rancher had reportedly lost an entire section of pasture overnight after the ground collapsed into black water below. We eventually reached a small farm owned by a man named Harold Wayne. Harold agreed to speak only after Carl explained why we were there. Unlike most locals, Harold did not treat the stories casually. His expression changed immediately when Sinkhole Sam was mentioned. 3 years earlier, one of his cattle disappeared near a flooded drainage ditch connected to a nearby sink formation. At first, he blamed coyotes or theft. Then he found the tracks, not footprints, body impressions, a long, smooth crossing wet mud from the ditch toward deeper water inside the sinkhole basin. The mark measured nearly 4 feet across at its widest section. Harold showed us the area personally later that afternoon. The drainage ditch itself looked shallow now due to drought, but the sinkhole beyond it remained filled with dark, stagnant water surrounded by reeds and broken fencing. Several cattle refused to graze near it, even with fresh grass growing nearby. Animals noticed things humans ignored. Harold pointed toward the far edge of the basin. That's where it surfaced. According to him, he spotted something large moving through the sinkhole shortly before dawn, one morning while searching for the missing cow. At first he assumed part of the ground itself was shifting beneath fog, then the water rose around it. He described seeing a pale head partially above the surface, followed by a section of body long enough to disappear back beneath the water before he could judge its full size. "What kind of animal was it?" I asked. Harold answered immediately, "No animal I know." Carl examined the muddy shoreline while we spoke. Then he mentioned for me quietly, "Fresh disturbances crossed part of the basin edge. The mud carried long sliding impressions leading toward the water, and near one section of exposed clay, a strange slick coating reflected in the sunlight, much like the residue near the collapsed pier." Carl touched it carefully with a stick. The substance stretched slightly before breaking apart. Organic, fresh. Then we heard movement from inside the sinkhole basin, not splashing. Something shifting beneath reeds near the center of the water. Harold stepped back instantly. Carl remained motionless. The reeds bent slowly outward in a line moving beneath the surface toward the deeper section of the sinkhole. Then bubbles rose, large ones, several at once. The water around them darkened briefly as though something massive has rolled underneath, and then the center of the sinkhole exhaled. A deep, hollow sound rose from beneath the water itself. Not a roar, not a growl. Air moving upward through something far below the surface. Carl stared into the basin silently, then he whispered, "It's deeper than the lake." That sound from the sinkhole stayed with me long after we left Harold Vane's property. Not because it was loud, because it sounded distant, as though the air had traveled upward through a long underground space before reaching the surface. Carl Dugan believed the same thing. "The water is connected underneath," he said during the drive back toward town. "Always has been." I asked, "Connected to what?" Carl looked out across the dry Kansas fields for several moments before answering, "Whatever carved those holes in the first place." That evening, a storm system moved across the plains unexpectedly fast. Heavy rain began falling shortly after dark, flooding low drainage channels around the farmland and pushing runoff toward the lake basins. By midnight, Carl arrived at my lodging carrying a lantern and told me Harold Vane had sent word from Dry Creek Road. Something had opened near the pasture. We reached the farm shortly before 1 in the morning. Rain hammered the fields hard enough to blur visibility, while lightning flashed constantly beyond the horizon. Several cattle had broken through fencing and gathered near the road, refusing to move farther into the pasture. Harold met us near the barn, visibly shaken. Part of the ground near the drainage ditch had collapsed entirely after the storm began. Not a small depression, a hole. The earth had given way beside the original sinkhole basin, exposing a jagged opening descending directly into black water below. Rainwater poured steadily into it from the surrounding field. The hole measured perhaps 15 feet across at its widest point, and from somewhere inside it, water moved, not downward with the runoff, upward. Carl lowered his lantern carefully near the edge while Harold kept several steps back. The exposed shaft descended farther than the light could fully reach. Rock walls curved inward beneath the soil layer as though the farmland above rested atop older underground caverns. Then lightning flashed overhead. For one instant, something pale moved below the surface inside the opening, large, long, gone immediately afterward. Harold whispered, "You saw that too?" Nobody answered. The rain intensified around us while the hole continued swallowing runoff from the pasture. Then another sound echoed upward from below. Movement. Heavy movement. Not water collapsing. Something shifting through water deep inside the underground chamber beneath the farm. Carl suddenly stepped backward from the edge. The water level inside the opening had begun rising unnaturally fast. Then bubbles erupted across the surface below, large clusters bursting upward from the darkness, and moments later, part of a head surfaced briefly within the shaft, pale gray, broad, smooth-skinned, far larger than the opening should have allowed. Only the top section became visible before sinking again beneath the underground water, but it was enough. Harold stumbled backward immediately. One of the cattle near the fence began panicking violently. Then came a deeper sound from below, a second movement, another shape, smaller, crossing beneath the surface behind the first. Carl stared into the hole silently for several long seconds. Then he spoke the thought none of us wanted confirmed. There's more than one living down there. At that exact moment, part of the ground near the edge cracked sharply beneath our feet. The collapse spread another few feet outward toward the pasture, and from somewhere deep below the Kansas farmland, something struck the underside of the earth. The impact beneath the ground sounded like distant thunder directly under our feet. The soil along the edge of the collapse shifted violently. Harold Wayne shouted and stumbled backward as another section of pasture broke away into the opening below. Mud and rainwater poured downward through the widening crack, while the cattle near the fence panicked harder, pulling against the rails trying to escape the field entirely. Carl grabbed my shoulder and forced me several steps away from the edge. Good timing. A second collapse followed immediately afterward. Part of the drainage ditch disappeared into the sinkhole with a heavy grinding sound, exposing more of the underground shaft beneath the farmland. For a brief moment, lightning illuminated the interior clearly. Rock walls, floodwater, and movement. Something large rolled beneath the surface, deep below us, pale against the black water before vanishing again. Then the earth stopped moving. Rain continued hammering the fields, but the collapse stabilized temporarily. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Harold stared at the widening hole in disbelief. That thing's under my land. Carl answered quietly, no, your land's over it. That distinction settled heavily over the three of us. The underground space did not resemble a simple sinkhole anymore. It resembled part of a much larger flooded system extended beneath the surrounding farmland. And whatever lived inside it had likely been there long before the farms existed above. By dawn, word of the collapse had spread across the area. Several neighboring ranchers arrived to inspect the damage, while county officials prepared barriers around the unstable section of pasture. Official explanations focused on erosion and underground water pressure after drought conditions. No one mentioned the movement below the surface, not publicly, but privately. Several locals admitted they had heard stories for years about breathing holes opening after storms near old sink formations. One elderly rancher claimed cattle occasionally vanished entirely after heavy rains without tracks leading away. "Grounds takes him," he muttered. Carl didn't argue. Later that afternoon, after most people left the farm, Carl brought me back near the collapse alone. The rain had stopped by then, leaving fog drifting across the soaked pasture. The sinkhole opening looked larger in daylight, wider, deeper. The water inside remained strangely calm despite runoff still entering from the ditch above. Carl pointed toward one side of the exposed shaft wall. Marks crossed the wet rock just above the waterline, long scrape impressions, parallel. No fresh damage from collapsing earth, repeated marks, as though something large had brushed against the stone while moving through the underground passage. Then we heard it again. A deep, hollow exhale rising slowly from below, this time closer. The water inside the shaft rippled outward in expanding circles. Carl lowered his lantern carefully toward the edge. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then bubbles surfaced near the center of the underground pool. One cluster, then another, and finally a third farther back inside the darkness beyond the lantern light. Movement followed them, slow, heavy. Something passed beneath the underground water deep inside the cavern system. Then another shape crossed behind it, smaller, following the same path. Carl pulled the lantern back immediately. Neither of us spoke while backing away from the edge, because by then the realization had become unavoidable. Sinkhole Sam was not simply using the underground system beneath Kansas. It belonged there. 3 days after the collapse at Dry Creek Road, officials finally brought in a geological survey team from Wichita to inspect the sinkhole system beneath the farmland. Publicly, the concern involved unstable ground and possible underground water erosion. Privately, locals wanted answers about what moved below the surface. Most of the surveyors dismissed the stories immediately. To them, Sinkhole Sam belonged in the same category as ghost stories and exaggerated fishing tales. But the underground caverns beneath the farm interested them, especially after preliminary depth readings failed repeatedly near the flooded shaft. One instrument reportedly lost connection entirely after being lowered past a certain point. Carl Dugan warned the team not to enter the underground water directly. They ignored him. By late afternoon, 2 survey workers and a diver prepared a cable rig beside the collapse opening, while several others monitored equipment from the surface. A crowd of locals gathered at a distance from the barriers. Nobody seemed comfortable standing too close to the edge anymore. The diver descended shortly before sunset. For several minutes, communication remained normal. He described submerged rock formations extending farther than expected beneath the farm, along with tunnel-like passages disappearing into darkness beyond the main chamber. Then his voice changed. The diver reported movement, not current. Something displacing water deeper inside one of the tunnels. The surface crew asked for clarification repeatedly. No clear answer came back, only breathing over the radio. Then static. Carl stared at the water immediately after the transmission cut. The underground pool had gone completely still. One technician attempted pulling the cable back manually. At first it resisted, then suddenly moved upward too easily. The diver resurfaced moments later near the edge of the cavern opening, but without his mask. He looked terrified. Before anyone could question him properly, he began shouting the same sentence repeatedly. "There's more tunnels." The crew pulled him fully out of the shaft while he struggled to catch his breath. According to the diver, the underground chamber connected to multiple flooded passages extended far beyond the farm itself. Some narrow, some enormous. He claimed he saw movement following him through one of the deeper tunnels after his light passed over a pale section of smooth skin beneath the water. "What kind of movement?" one surveyor asked. The diver answered immediately, "Intentional." That word spread quietly through the gathered crowd. Intentional, not drifting, not animal panic, tracking. The survey leader still attempted to continue operations despite the diver refusing to descend again. Another cable camera was lowered into the shaft shortly after dark. This time, dozens of people watched the monitor near the equipment truck. At first, the footage showed only murky water and rock walls descending beneath the farm. Then the camera entered a large flooded tunnel. The passage extended beyond the light range entirely. Sediment drifted slowly through the water. For several long seconds, nothing appeared. Then the beam crossed something pale along the cavern wall. Not rock, skin. Smooth gray surface curving away into the darkness, too large for the camera to capture fully. The operator froze the feed immediately. Then the shape moved slowly. The image jerked violently sideways. Static consumed the monitor, and the cable snapped. The snapped cable changed everything. Until that moment, even the skeptics at Dry Creek Road still believed there might be a reasonable explanation hidden somewhere beneath the panic. An oversized fish, a collapsing tunnel system, distorted footage, but the survey team knew the cable did not simply break from pressure. Something pulled it. The operator insisted he felt resistance moving in the opposite direction seconds before the line snapped completely. After that, no one volunteered to lower another camera into the shaft. The officials packed equipment slowly through the night while locals watched from behind the barriers in near silence. The diver from earlier refused further interviews altogether. According to Carl Dugan, the man left Kansas before sunrise the next morning. But one detail from the footage spread quietly through the town almost immediately: the eye. Most of the camera image had dissolved into static too quickly for people to agree on details, except for one frame. Just before the signal vanished, the light briefly reflected across something turning in the water beside the camera. An eye, large, pale around the edges, not glowing like stories later exaggerated, simply aware, watching the equipment the same way a person watches another person entering a room unexpectedly. That was the part unsettling anyone. Recognition. Over the next several days, county officials restricted access to the Dry Creek collapse entirely. Official reports blamed unstable underground erosion systems connected to old aquifers beneath the farmland. No mention of movement, no mention of the footage, but rumors spread faster than explanations. Soon, people around Inman Lake began connecting older incidents together: missing livestock, strange bubbling water during drought years, unexplained sinkhole openings after storms. Even the disappearance of Matthew Harlow near the Southern Cove returned to conversation again after years of silence. Carl believed the lake activity would increase after the collapse. He opened part of the tunnels, he said. That idea sounded impossible at first, until the sightings began again. 2 fishermen reported lake wakes moving beneath shallow water near the western sinkholes. A farmer claimed something surfaced briefly inside an irrigation pond miles from the lake after heavy rain. And one truck driver traveling Dry Creek Road near dawn swore he saw part of a pale body stretched across a flooded ditch before it slipped beneath the waterline again. None of the sightings lasted long enough for certainty, but together they suggested movement, migration, like something beneath the plains had become active after the underground system was disturbed. One evening near sunset, Carl and I returned to the western edge of the lake overlooking the largest sinkhole. The water remained perfectly still, then bubbles surfaced near the center, slowly, one cluster after another. Carl watched them silently. Then he said something I had not considered before: "What if Sam isn't one creature?" I looked toward him. Carl kept watching the water. What if that's just the name people give him, whatever lives down there? The sinkhole released another deep burst of bubbles, and beneath the dark water, something large shifted direction. Autumn storms arrived early that year across central Kansas. Weeks of rain transformed by ditches into flowing channels and filled low farmland basins that had remained cracked from drought only a month earlier. The water changed everything. Creeks connected temporarily to ponds, drainage systems overflowed into sinkholes, and according to locals around Inman Lake, that was when the underground system became most active. Carl Dugan described it simply: the plains open up. Reports started arriving from farther away than before, not just near the lake. A rancher nearly 20 miles south claimed something large surfaced briefly in a flooded cattle trench after midnight. Another farmer found strange, smooth drag marks crossing a submerged field between 2 sink formations after heavy rain. And several residents along Dry Creek Road heard movement beneath standing floodwater at night despite seeing nothing on the surface. The sightings no longer felt isolated, they felt connected, as though rising groundwater had reopened hidden routes beneath the plains. County workers attempted seeding portions of the dry creek collapsed with gravel and reinforced barriers, but the effort failed repeatedly. The water underneath kept shifting. Sections of to fill material disappeared overnight into the flooded cavern below. One worker reportedly quit after hearing what he described as breathing echoing upward from inside the shaft before dawn. Officially, the story never reached newspapers beyond brief mentions of unstable erosion zones. Unofficially, people stopped traveling certain back roads after dark entirely, especially during rain. One evening, Carl asked me to accompany him to an old flood channel west of the lake where several recent sightings had occurred. The place looked more like marshland now than farmland. Floodwater stretched between tall grass while partially submerged fence posts disappeared into darkness beneath the cloudy sky. Carl carried no fishing equipment this time, only a lantern. We followed the edge of the flooded channel carefully until we reached a narrow bridge crossing shallow black water. Then Carl stopped walking. The bridge supports carried fresh slime along the lower beams, the same slick residue found near the southern cove and Harold Vane's Sinkhole basin. But this time there was more of it. Long streaks dragged upward against the wood several feet above the waterline. Something large had passed beneath the bridge recently, very recently. Carl lowered the lantern toward the water carefully. At first nothing moved. Then a ripple crossed the flood channel from the darkness beyond the bridge, not caused by wind, directed movement. Another ripple followed beside it, parallel. Two separate wakes moving slowly toward us beneath the black water. Carl backed away immediately. The wake stopped. For several long seconds, the floodwater became perfectly still again. Then bubbles surfaced directly beneath the center of the bridge. Large, slow bubbles rising from below. The lantern light reflected briefly across something pale beneath the surface, long, smooth, curving downward again into darkness. Then another shape crossed behind it, smaller, following close beside the larger body below before both disappeared beneath the flooded channel. Carl grabbed my arm. "We leave now." We had barely reached the road when a deep sound rolled upward from beneath the floodwater behind us. Not a roar, not an animal cry, something deeper, like air moving through vast underground chambers beneath the flooded Kansas plains. By late autumn, people around Inman Lake had quietly changed their routines. Nobody announced it openly. They simply adopted. Farmers stopped checking flooded pastures alone after dark. Children no longer swam near drainage basins during storm season. And fishermen avoided western sinkholes entirely once evening settled over the lake. The strange part was how normal those changes became, as if the region had accepted that something moved beneath the water systems connecting the plains, not everywhere, but enough places to matter. Carl Dugan believed the survey collapse had exposed only a tiny section of the underground network. One night, while studying old county maps spread across his kitchen table, he showed me something unsettling. Many of the reported sightings aligned almost perfectly with older underground water routes beneath the region. Dry creek beds, collapsed sink formations, flood basins connected during heavy rain. According to Carl, the underground system beneath Kansas stretched much farther than most people realized. The lake was never isolated, it was an access point. What if those tunnels run for miles? I asked. Carl answered quietly, what if they always have? That idea changed the sightings entirely, not a creature trapped inside one lake, something traveling beneath entire sections of farmland unnoticed for generations. Over the following weeks, stories continued spreading from towns farther away. A ranch had claimed he saw a pale body moving beneath ice forming over a flooded ditch at dawn. Another man repairing culverts reported hearing movement inside drainage pipes large enough to echo through the ground. Most dismissed such accounts publicly, but privately people listened more carefully now, especially after the incident near Miller's Basin. Miller's Basin was a seasonal flood depression several miles east of the lake, connected indirectly to underground runoff channels. During heavy rain, it filled almost completely. Two local hunters crossed the basin shortly after sunset, searching for waterfowl blinds abandoned earlier in the season. Only one returned before morning. According to the survivor, they noticed bubbling water near the reeds before hearing movement beneath the shallow floodwater around them. At first, they assumed large fish trapped in the basin. Then something surfaced briefly beside the second hunter. Not fully, just enough pale body and length to reveal impossible size. The survivor ran immediately. When search teams arrived the next day, they found no body, only disturbed water and long, smooth drag marks leading toward one of the basin's sink openings. Carl listened to the story without surprise. Then he said something I had begun suspecting myself. Maybe we're only seeing them during flood season, because that's when they come closer to the surface. Closer, not emerging from nowhere. Traveling upward through connected underground waterways already beneath us. That night, strong wind rolled across the plains while rain hammered the roof outside Carl's house. Near midnight, the power failed briefly across the area. For several seconds, everything went dark. Then from somewhere beyond the flooded fields behind the property came the sound again, deep, hollow, air moving through unseen water tunnels beneath the earth itself. Carl remained still beside the window listening, then quietly spoke into the darkness. "They're moving tonight." By morning, the storm had passed over Kansas and left the land soaked, quiet, and strangely reset, like nothing unusual had ever happened beneath it. But people knew better now. Floodwater had receded from the fields, exposing the same shallow grooves and sink-edge disturbances that always appeared after heavy rain. Around Inman Lake, the western sinkholes looked unchanged on the surface, yet Carl Dugan refused to go near them again. He didn't need to explain why. Everyone understood that silence now meant presence, not absence. Reports after that storm came in faster than before. A drainage crew near Dry Creek Road claimed their inspection camera briefly registered movement inside a culvert system that should have been dry. A rancher 2 miles east said his cattle refused to cross a flooded lowland even after the water had fully cleared. And one final account, never officially recorded, came from a railroad maintenance worker who swore something long and pale moved beneath a flooded track bed before vanishing into a collapsed drainage sink. No one confirmed these sightings, no one denied them either. The pattern had already formed in people's minds. Whatever Sinkhole Sam was, it wasn't confined to one lake anymore. It moved through the hidden geography beneath the plains. Carl and I returned one last time to the western edge of the lake before I left the region. The sinkhole water was calm again, too calm. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel natural anymore once you've seen what exists underneath it. Carl stood for a long time without speaking. Then he pointed toward the center of the largest sinkhole. No bubbles, no movement, just depth. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "it doesn't show itself at all." I asked what he meant. Carl looked at the water. "Doesn't need to." We stayed there until when the light finally faded. The lake reflected the sky perfectly, undisturbed, ordinary, almost peaceful. And for a moment I almost believed the entire thing had been exaggerated, until I noticed the water near the far sinkhole shift slightly. Not outward, downward, as if something beneath had adjusted its position, not rising, not surfacing, just moving beneath everything. Carl noticed it too. He didn't point, he didn't speak. He simply turned away from the water and started walking back toward the road. And I followed, because in the end, that was what Sinkhole Sam left behind. Not proof, not certainty, just the understanding that beneath the flat fields of Kansas, something still moves, and it has learned the shape of land above it.